The gunshot echoed across the endless Montana prairie as Vivian Reed stood frozen at the threshold of her small homestead, watching her husband of 6 years ride away without so much as a backward glance. It was May 1883, and the harsh winter had finally released its grip on Silver Creek, but the cold between them had only deepened with the thaw. Vivian's hands trembled as she clutched the weathered porch post. 8 months since Andrew had spoken more than 10 words to her at a time. 8 months since the stillbirth of their second child had left her hollow and him unreachable. She watched until his silhouette disappeared into the golden horizon, the setting sun painting the landscape in hues of amber and crimson. "He'll be back by sundown tomorrow," she whispered to herself, though the words held less conviction than they once had. Andrew Reed had become as unpredictable as the Montana weather, cold and distant one moment, present but silent the next. The evening breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and sage as Vivian moved about the cabin, preparing a simple dinner she would eat alone. Again. At 32, she'd never imagined this growing distance between them. Not after everything they'd been through together, the journey west from Boston, building this homestead with their bare hands, the birth of their son James, now 5 years old and mercifully asleep after a day of endless questions about when Papa would return. "Mama, is Papa coming home tonight?" James had asked before bed. "Not tonight, little one. He's gone to town for supplies." The lie had slipped easily from her lips, protecting her son from a truth she herself couldn't bear, that his father rode to town not for necessities, but to escape the grief that had consumed their home. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as Vivian moved to the window, her gaze drifting toward the town of Silver Creek, 5 miles to the east. Andrew would be at Thornton's saloon by now, drowning his sorrows in whiskey, perhaps finding comfort in the simple camaraderie of other ranchers and cowboys that seemed to elude him at home. Once, Andrew Reed had been the most attentive husband in the territory. When they'd married in Boston in 1877, he'd promised adventure and a life built on love. For 5 years, he'd kept that promise. His calloused hands had been gentle when they held hers, his blue eyes warm when they met her gaze across the dinner table. But the baby girl they'd lost last September had taken something from both of them, something vital that Vivian feared might never return. Sleep came fitfully that night, as it always did when Andrew was away. Vivian woke before dawn, her nightgown damp with sweat despite the cool spring air. She dressed quickly and moved through her morning chores with practiced efficiency, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs before preparing breakfast for James. "When's Papa coming home?" James asked through a mouthful of porridge, his dark curls so like Andrew's falling across his forehead. "Later today," Vivian replied, smoothing his hair back. "Now eat up. Mrs. Henderson is expecting us." The widow Henderson lived a mile down the road and had offered to watch James while Vivian handled the afternoon chores. At 58, Martha Henderson had become a surrogate mother to Vivian since they'd settled in Silver Creek, offering wisdom and companionship that Vivian desperately needed, especially now. "Vivian Reed, you look like you haven't slept in a week," Martha declared when they arrived, her shrewd eyes taking in Vivian's appearance. "James, honey, I believe I've got some wooden soldiers in the chest by the fireplace. Why don't you go see?" Once James was occupied, Martha guided Vivian to the kitchen table and pressed a cup of strong coffee into her hands. "He went to town again, didn't he?" Vivian nodded, her throat tight. "I don't know how to reach him anymore, Martha. It's like living with a ghost." Martha's weathered hand covered Vivian's. "Grief affects men differently, child. They don't have our ways of healing. Can't cry it out, can't talk it through. They bottle it up until it poisons them." "It's been 8 months, Vivian whispered. "How long before we find our way back to each other?" "That depends on both of you," Martha said gently. "Have you truly grieved yourself, or have you been so busy worrying about him that you've put your own heart aside?" The question struck Vivian like a physical blow. Had she? Between caring for James, maintaining the homestead, and worrying about Andrew's increasing distance, had she ever properly mourned their daughter? "I don't know," she admitted. "Then perhaps that's where you start," Martha suggested. "You can't help him find his way back if you're lost yourself." The wisdom of Martha's words stayed with Vivian as she completed her chores that afternoon. By the time she collected James and headed home, the sun was beginning its descent. Andrew would be returning soon if he returned at all. The thought sent a chill through her. What if one day he simply didn't come back? The fear had been growing, taking root in the fertile soil of her anxiety. She'd heard the whispers in town about cowboys who abandoned their families, seeking fortune in the gold fields of California or the cattle ranches of Texas. "Mama, look." James pointed excitedly as they crested the hill overlooking their homestead. A rider approached from the east Andrew, his broad shoulders unmistakable even at a distance. Relief washed over Vivian, followed immediately by apprehension. Which Andrew would greet them tonight? The silent, brooding man of recent months, or some shadow of the husband she'd once known. She quickened their pace, reaching the cabin just as Andrew dismounted. His face was unshaven, eyes bloodshot from drink and lack of sleep, but he managed a small smile for James, who ran to him with unbridled enthusiasm. "Papa, did you bring me something?" James bounced on his toes as Andrew reached into his saddlebag. "Might have," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. He produced a small wooden horse, crudely carved but recognizable. "Made it myself." James accepted the gift with delight, immediately galloping it through the air. "Thank you, Papa. Can we go fishing tomorrow? You promised last time." A flicker of something guilt perhaps crossed Andrew's features. "We'll see, son. Got a lot of work to catch up on." Vivian stepped forward, taking James gently by the shoulders. "Why don't you go put your new horse with the others while I help Papa with his gear?" Once James had scampered inside, silence descended between them, heavy as a winter blanket. "You're back earlier than I expected," Vivian ventured, taking the reins of Andrew's horse. Supplies were low at the general store, shipment delayed. Another lie, as transparent as her own had been to James. They both knew he hadn't gone for supplies. Andrew moved past her toward the water pump, splashing his face and neck before running wet hands through his dark hair. At 36, he was still as handsome as the day they'd met, though new lines etched his face and silver threaded his temples. "Did you eat?" Vivian asked, desperate to maintain some semblance of normalcy. "At the saloon." He dried his face on his sleeve. "I'll tend to Apollo, you go on inside." Dismissal, always dismissal. Vivian felt her patience stretched thin over months of emotional solitude finally snap. "No," she said firmly. Andrew paused, turning to face her with surprise evident in his expression. "No, I will not go on inside as if nothing is wrong. I will not pretend for one more day that this coldness between us is normal. I will not," her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "I will not lose you too, Andrew. I cannot bear it." For a moment, something like the old Andrew flickered in his eyes, concern, perhaps even tenderness. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by the now familiar wall of indifference. "Vivian, I'm tired. It's been a long ride." "And I'm tired of being alone in our marriage," she countered, stepping closer. "We lost her, Andrew, both of us, but I'm still here. James is still here. And she gestured helplessly, "you're somewhere else entirely." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Leave it be, Vive." "I can't," the words burst from her with unexpected force. "Do you think I don't see you slipping away? Do you think I don't lie awake wondering if each time you ride out will be the last? If you'll decide one day that we're not enough reason to come back." Her husband stared at her, his blue eyes unreadable in the fading light. For a heartbeat, Vivian thought she might have reached him. Then he turned away, leading Apollo toward the small stable without another word. Vivian remained rooted to the spot, tears streaming unchecked down her face. She had failed again to bridge the gulf between them, and the realization left her hollow. With leaden steps, she returned to the cabin, where James waited with innocent expectation that his family remained whole. Dinner that night was a silent affair, save for James's chatter about his day with Mrs. Henderson and his plans for the wooden horse. Andrew ate mechanically, responding to his son's questions with single words or nods. When the meal concluded, he retreated outside to smoke his pipe, as had become his custom. Vivian cleared the table and settled James into bed with a story, her heart heavy with the knowledge that nothing had changed. Perhaps nothing would. "Mama," James's small voice pulled her from her thoughts as she tucked the quilt around him. Yes, sweetheart. Is Papa sad because of the baby sister who went to heaven? The innocent question pierced Vivian's heart. She'd never discussed the stillbirth with James directly, unsure how to explain such loss to a child so young, yet somehow he understood. Yes, she answered honestly. He's very sad about that, James nodded solemnly. I'm sad too sometimes, but then I remember what you told me that she's watching over us like the stars at night. Vivian swallowed hard, smoothing his curls. That's right. Maybe Papa just needs to look at the stars more, James suggested with childlike simplicity. Maybe he does, Vivian agreed, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Sleep well, my love. By the time she emerged from James's room, Andrew had returned inside. He sat at the table, a leather-bound journal open before him, the accounts for their small cattle operation, most likely. In the lamplight, with his head bent in concentration, he looked almost like the man she'd married. Vivian busied herself with mending, stealing glances at him from her place by the fire. The silence between them stretched, not entirely uncomfortable but charged with all they weren't saying. Finally, Andrew closed the journal and rubbed his eyes. The north fence needs repair. Spotted it on my way back. I'll handle it tomorrow. I can help, Vivian offered. Mrs. Henderson mentioned she'd like James to come by again. She's teaching him to whittle. Andrew's response was a noncommittal grunt, but he hadn't outright refused her company. Vivian counted it as progress, however small. Andrew, she began carefully, setting aside her mending, I've been thinking about planting a tree, for her, behind the house where the wildflowers grow. The rigidity in his shoulders told her she'd ventured into dangerous territory, but Vivian pressed on. We never gave her a proper marker, nothing to acknowledge that she was here, even briefly. She wasn't here, Andrew said flatly. She never took a breath. She existed, Vivian insisted, rising from her chair. She was our daughter, and she deserves to be remembered. Andrew stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. I'm turning in. Dawn comes early. He disappeared into their bedroom without waiting for her response, effectively ending the conversation. Vivian remained by the fire, tears of frustration burning her eyes. How could they heal if he refused to even speak of their loss? Yet as she prepared for bed later, a small surprise awaited. Andrew had left a space for her beside him rather than positioning himself at the edge of the mattress, as had become his habit. It was a tiny gesture, perhaps unconscious, but it kindled a flicker of hope in Vivian's heart. She slipped beneath the quilt carefully, holding her breath as Andrew shifted in his sleep. To her astonishment, his arm draped across her waist, pulling her closer as he mumbled something unintelligible. For the first time in months, Vivian fell asleep in her husband's embrace, clinging to the possibility that somewhere beneath his frozen exterior, the warmth of the man she loved might still burn. Morning arrived with a gentle spring rain pattering against the cabin roof. Vivian woke to find Andrew's side of the bed empty, but the aroma of coffee filled the small home, another deviation from recent routine that kindled hope in her chest. In the kitchen, she found him at the stove, frying salt pork and potatoes while James set the table with exaggerated care. Papa's making breakfast, James announced proudly. I'm helping. I can see that, Vivian replied, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. She approached cautiously as one might a skittish horse. Good morning. Andrew glanced at her briefly. Coffee's fresh. It wasn't much, certainly not a declaration of renewed affection, but after months of morning silence, it felt monumental. Vivian poured herself a cup, savoring the rich aroma. Rain might delay the fence repair, she observed. Andrew nodded. Looks to be clearing by mid-morning. We can head out then. We. The simple pronoun sent a wave of relief through Vivian. He hadn't rejected her offer of help. Breakfast passed with easier conversation than they'd managed in months, primarily driven by James's endless questions about fencing and cattle. Andrew answered patiently, occasionally meeting Vivian's gaze across the table with something less than his recent coldness. After delivering James to Mrs. Henderson's care, they rode together toward the north pasture. The rain had indeed stopped, leaving the world washed clean and fragrant. Spring wildflowers dotted the prairie in vibrant splashes of color against the endless green. Beautiful country, Andrew remarked unexpectedly as they crested a rise. Sometimes I forget to notice. Vivian glanced at him, startled by the observation. It is beautiful, especially after rain. They worked side by side repairing the damaged fence, falling into a rhythm that reminded Vivian of earlier days. Andrew handed her tools without being asked, anticipated her movements, and occasionally their hands brushed brief contacts that sent currents of awareness through her. "You've gotten good at this," he commented as she deftly secured a fence post. "Better than some of the hands I've hired." Vivian smiled despite herself. "Necessity is an excellent teacher." True enough. Andrew paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "You've handled a lot on your own lately." The acknowledgement, the first indication he recognized his emotional absence, nearly stole Vivian's breath. "We manage," she said carefully, not wanting to break the fragile connection forming between them. They completed the repairs by mid-afternoon, both mud-spattered and weary but satisfied with the work. As they packed the tools onto their horses, Vivian noticed Andrew studying the western sky. "Storm coming?" she asked, following his gaze. "No." He hesitated, then pointed toward a distant grove of trees. "I was thinking about what you said, about planting a tree," Vivian's heart stuttered. "Yes, there's a stand of young aspens in that grove. They transplant well, I'm told." He turned to face her fully. "If you still want to do it." "I do," Vivian whispered, hope unfurling in her chest like a tentative blossom. "Very much." Andrew nodded once decisively. "We'll need to prepare the ground first, make sure it has the best chance to thrive." They rode homeward in companionable silence, the air between them lighter than it had been in months. Vivian didn't dare push for more, grateful for this small breakthrough. As they approached their homestead, she noticed smoke rising from the chimney. "Did you bank the fire before we left?" Andrew asked, frowning. "No," Vivian replied, alarm rising. "And Mrs. Henderson wouldn't bring James home this early." Andrew urged his horse forward, Vivian close behind. They arrived to find a strange horse tethered outside their cabin, a fine chestnut stallion with an elaborate Mexican saddle. "Stay back," Andrew warned, drawing the revolver from his hip holster. "Andrew, no," Vivian began, but he was already dismounting, approaching the cabin with cautious steps. The door swung open before he reached it, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the interior light. "Put that iron away, Reed, unless you plan to shoot your brother-in-law." Alexander Montgomery stepped onto the porch, his elegant attire incongruous against the rustic backdrop of the homestead. At 38, Vivian's older brother retained the polished demeanor of Boston society despite 5 years in the West. "Alex," Vivian exclaimed, dismounting hastily, "what on earth are you doing here?" "Is that any way to greet family?" Alex grinned, embracing her warmly. "I was in Helena on business and thought I'd surprise you." Andrew holstered his weapon, tension evident in his stance as he approached. "Montgomery, been a while." "Indeed it has, Reed." Alex extended his hand, which Andrew shook briefly. "Hope you don't mind I made myself at home." Cabin was unlocked, and the ride from Helena was damper than anticipated. "Of course not," Vivian assured him, though she noted Andrew's discomfort. Her brother and husband had never quite warmed to each other, their backgrounds and temperaments too dissimilar for easy friendship. "But where is James? Did you see him at Mrs. Henderson's?" "The charming widow directed me here, said you'd be back shortly. The boy's still with her, something about finishing a whittling project." Alex gestured toward the cabin. "I've put coffee on, shall we?" Inside, Alex regaled them with tales of his business ventures in Helena, where he'd established himself as a successful banker after following Vivian west. His presence filled the small cabin, leaving little room for the ghosts that had haunted it for months. "And how are you, little sister?" Alex asked eventually, his keen eyes assessing her. "Your letters have been circumspect of late." Vivian glanced at Andrew, who had retreated to his customary silence. "We're managing." The winter was difficult, understanding dawned in Alex's expression. Their last correspondence had been in August, before the stillbirth. "I see, I'm sorry to hear that." An uncomfortable silence descended, broken only when Andrew stood abruptly. "I should fetch James, it's getting late." "I'll come with you," Vivian offered, but Andrew shook his head. "Stay. Catch up with your brother, we won't be long." After he departed, Alex turned to Vivian with concern evident in his features. "What's happened, Vivian? And don't tell me nothing. I can see it in both your faces." The simple question, asked with genuine concern, broke the dam of Vivian's composure. Words poured forth about the baby girl they'd lost, about Andrew's gradual withdrawal, about the months of isolation and uncertainty. Alex listened without interruption, his hand covering hers on the table. "Have you considered coming back to Boston?" he asked when she'd finished. "Just for a while, a change might do you good, especially with Mother's health declining." Vivian looked up sharply. "Mother is ill, you didn't mention, nothing serious yet," Alex assured her. "But she's not getting younger and she asks about you constantly, about James too. She's never even met her grandson." The realization struck Vivian forcefully. In their determination to build a life in Montana, they'd created an unbridgeable distance from her remaining family. Perhaps that was part of what ailed her now, the lack of a support network beyond Martha Henderson's kind but limited assistance. "I can't leave," she said finally. "Not now. Andrew and I were finding our way back to each other, slowly." Alex's skeptical expression spoke volumes. "Are you?" "Because from where I sit, he looks as remote as these mountains." "You've been here an hour," Vivian defended. "You can't possibly know what's in his heart." "Perhaps not," Alex conceded, "but I know when my sister is unhappy, and you, Vivian, are deeply unhappy." Before she could respond, the door opened to admit Andrew and an excited James, who launched himself at his uncle with unbridled enthusiasm. "Uncle Alex, did you bring me something from the city? Papa said you might have." Alex laughed, lifting the boy onto his knee. "As a matter of fact, I did. But it's tucked away in my saddlebags for morning, too special to be seen in lamplight." The evening progressed more pleasantly than Vivian had dared hope, with James's presence easing the tension between the adults. After putting him to bed, they sat around the table sharing a bottle of fine whiskey Alex had brought from Helena. "This place has potential," Alex remarked, eyeing the cabin's interior. "With some investment, you could expand the operation considerably." Andrew's expression hardened slightly. "We manage with what we have." "No doubt," Alex replied smoothly, "but a man with your knowledge of cattle could do more than manage. I know several investors in Helena looking for promising ventures." "Not interested in partners," Andrew said flatly, "or debt." Alex raised an eyebrow. "Pride is an expensive luxury out here, Reed." "So is dependency," Andrew countered. "I've seen what happens to ranchers who get in deep with city money men, no offense." "None taken." Alex sipped his whiskey thoughtfully. "But there's a difference between wise investment and dependency. Something to consider, especially with a family to provide for." The implication that Andrew wasn't adequately providing for Vivian and James hung in the air like gunsmoke. Vivian intervened before the conversation could deteriorate further. "How long can you stay, Alex?" "Just 2 days," he replied, reading the situation. "Have to be back in Helena by week's end. Banking waits for no man, especially in these booming times." The conversation turned to safer topics: territorial politics, the railroad's expansion, mutual acquaintances from Boston who had ventured west. By the time they retired for the night, with Alex taking James's bed while the boy slept with his parents, the atmosphere had relaxed considerably. In the privacy of their bedroom, Vivian expected Andrew to retreat once more behind his wall of silence. Instead, he surprised her. "Your brother hasn't changed," he observed, removing his boots. "Still thinks money solves everything." "He means well," Vivian defended gently. "He worries about us." Andrew looked at her directly. "Did you tell him about the baby?" Vivian nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "Yes, and about how things have been between us." She expected anger or withdrawal, but Andrew merely sighed, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. "I suppose that's fair." "He suggested I might visit Boston," Vivian said carefully. "Just for a while. Mother is apparently in declining health." Andrew's shoulders stiffened. "Is that what you want, to go back east?" "No," Vivian answered truthfully. "But I thought you should know he offered." Andrew was silent for a long moment, his back to her as he stared at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice held an emotion Vivian hadn't heard in months: vulnerability. Would you be happier there, in Boston, with your family? The question cracked open something in Vivian's chest. She moved to sit beside him, close but not touching. My family is here, Andrew. You and James, this is where I want to be, he nodded once, eyes still fixed on the rough wooden floor. Even with things as they are, things don't have to stay as they are, Vivian ventured, reaching tentatively to touch his hand. Today felt different, better. Andrew didn't pull away from her touch, which felt like its own kind of victory. I'm trying, Vive. I know it doesn't seem like it, but I am. I know, she whispered, feeling tears threaten. I know you are. They retired to bed with a fragile new understanding between them, and for the second night in a row, Andrew held her as they drifted to sleep. Progress, Vivian thought. Small but real. Alex's visit, brief as it was, acted as a catalyst. His presence disrupted the patterns they'd fallen into, forcing both Vivian and Andrew to see their situation through an outsider's eyes. The morning after Alex's departure, Andrew approached Vivian with an unexpected proposal. I've been thinking about what your brother said, he began as they cleaned up after breakfast. Not about the investors, that's still not happening, but about expanding. Vivian paused in her dish washing. Expanding the ranch, Andrew nodded, leaning against the counter beside her. We've got the land. With some additional cattle and maybe another hand or two during calving season, we could double production within 2 years. That would require capital, Vivian pointed out, echoing her brother's argument. Some, Andrew agreed. But not as much as Alex would have us believe. I've been saving. Not a fortune, but enough to make a start. Vivian stared at him in surprise. You never mentioned saving. A hint of the old Andrew, the one who planned and dreamed with her, shone through as he explained. Been putting aside a little from each cattle sale. Thought it might be for James's education someday, or, he hesitated, for the other children we plan to have. The reference to their lost hopes struck Vivian like a physical blow, but it was the fact that Andrew had spoken of it voluntarily that truly astonished her. I think it's a wonderful idea, she said softly. To expand the ranch, I mean. Andrew met her gaze directly. It would mean more work. For both of us. I'm not afraid of work, Vivian reminded him. Never have been. Something like admiration flickered in Andrew's eyes. No, you certainly haven't been, he straightened, decision made. I'll ride to Silver Creek tomorrow, speak with the bank manager about our options. That afternoon, they selected an aspen sapling from the grove Andrew had pointed out. Together, they dug a hole behind the cabin where the spring wildflowers bloomed in profusion. Neither spoke as they carefully transplanted the young tree, but when Andrew's hands cradled the delicate roots with unexpected tenderness, Vivian felt something long frozen within her begin to thaw. What shall we call her? She asked as they patted down the soil around the slender trunk. The tree, I mean, Andrew's hands stilled. I always thought we'd name her after your mother, Elizabeth. The admission that he'd thought about their daughter's name, had plans and hopes for her, broke through the last of Vivian's reserves. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she nodded. Elizabeth, she agreed. It's perfect. Andrew's hand found hers, dirt-covered fingers intertwining. I'm sorry, Vive, for how I've been, for leaving you alone with all of it. You were grieving, Vivian said simply. So were you. His voice roughened, but you kept going. Kept this place running, kept James happy and healthy, and I just disappeared. You're here now, Vivian whispered, squeezing his hand. That's what matters. Andrew drew her to her feet, his blue eyes more present than they'd been in months. I don't deserve your forgiveness. It's not about deserving, Vivian told him. It's about choosing. And I choose us, Andrew, I always have. Something broke open in Andrew's expression, a dam crumbling after holding back a flood for too long. He pulled Vivian into his arms, burying his face in her hair as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. She held him tightly, her own tears flowing freely as they mourned together at last. I thought I was protecting you, Andrew confessed when he could speak again, by keeping it all inside. But I was just being a coward. You've never been a coward, Vivian countered fiercely. Never. They stood together beside the newly planted tree, holding each other as the afternoon sun bathed them in golden light. It wasn't a complete healing that would take more time and more honest conversations, but it was a beginning. a seed planted alongside the aspen that might, with care and patience, grow into something strong and enduring once more. Over the following weeks, Silver Creek witnessed a gradual transformation in the Reed household. Andrew rode into town less frequently, and when he did, it was for legitimate business rather than escape. He began working alongside Vivian on projects they'd long neglected, repairing the chicken coop, expanding the vegetable garden, reinforcing the cabin's roof before summer thunderstorms arrived. In late June, Andrew returned from town with unexpected news. "Met a man named Victor Holloway at the bank," he told Vivian as they shared an evening meal. "Cattle buyer from Wyoming. Says he's looking for quality stock to improve his herd." And, Vivian prompted, recognizing the spark of excitement in her husband's eyes. "And he's willing to pay premium prices for our best bull calves," Andrew explained. "Twice what we'd get at the regular auction." James looked up from his plate. "Does that mean we're rich, Papa?" Andrew laughed, a sound so long absent from their home that it startled them all. "Not rich, son. But it's a good opportunity." "When does he want them?" Vivian asked, already calculating what such a sale would mean for their expansion plans. "That's the thing," Andrew replied. "He needs to see the stock himself before committing, wants me to bring a few head to his ranch near Cheyenne." Vivian's heart sank. "Cheyenne, that's a week's journey at least." 10 days, more likely, Andrew confirmed, but the payoff would be worth it. Silence fell as Vivian absorbed the implications. 10 days or more with Andrew gone again, just when they'd begun to rebuild their connection. Just when she'd started to believe they might truly recover. "When would you leave?" she asked finally. "Week after next," Andrew said, watching her carefully. "Gives us time to select the best calves and make preparations." Vivian nodded mechanically, though anxiety churned within her. What if the distance undid all their progress? What if Andrew returned to find that the fragile bridge they'd built between them had collapsed in his absence later? As they prepared for bed, Andrew approached the subject again. "You've gone quiet," he observed, "about the Cheyenne trip." Vivian sighed, setting down her hairbrush. "I understand why it's important, I do. It's just you're worried," Andrew finished for her, sitting beside her on the edge of the bed. "That I'll withdraw again," she nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "It's foolish, I know." "Not foolish," Andrew countered, tilting her chin up gently, "but unnecessary. I'm not running away this time, Viv. This is for us, for our future." "I know that logically," Vivian admitted, "but after everything—" Andrew was quiet for a moment, considering, then he stood abruptly. "Wait here." He left the bedroom, returning moments later with something clutched in his hand. Sitting beside her again, he opened his palm to reveal a simple gold band, his wedding ring, which he hadn't worn since the day they'd buried their daughter. "I took this off because I felt I'd failed you," he explained, his voice husky with emotion. "Failed as a husband, as a father, didn't deserve to wear it anymore." Vivian's breath caught as Andrew slid the ring onto his finger where it belonged. "I'm not that man anymore," he continued. "The one who runs when things get hard, the one who leaves you to carry everything alone." He took her hands in his, the gold band warm against her skin. "I'm your husband, Vivian Reed, in joy and in sorrow, in plenty and in want, just like I promised 6 years ago." Tears welled in Vivian's eyes. "Andrew, I'll go to Cheyenne because it's the right thing for our future," he continued. "But I'll come back to you, always. You have my word." The conviction in his voice, the warmth in his eyes, these were the things Vivian had feared lost forever. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "I believe you." That night, for the first time since before the stillbirth, they came together as husband and wife, rediscovering each other with tender exploration. Andrew's hands, once so familiar but recently so distant, mapped the geography of Vivian's body with reverent attention. Their lovemaking was gentle, almost hesitant at first, then increasingly urgent as long-banked desires flared to life. "I love you," Andrew whispered against her skin, the words a balm to wounds Vivian had thought might never heal. "God help me, I've never stopped." In the aftermath, as they lay tangled together in the quiet darkness, Vivian felt a sense of completion she'd feared might never return. The road ahead wouldn't be without challenges. Grief had changed them both in ways that couldn't be undone, but they would walk it together. The day of Andrew's departure for Cheyenne dawned clear and mild, a perfect Montana summer morning. They'd selected 4 of their finest bull calves for the journey, and Andrew had hired a young cowhand named Timothy Walsh to accompany him. "Remember what we discussed," Vivian reminded Timothy as they prepared to depart. "No less than $40 per head and payment in bank drafts, not promises." Timothy nodded earnestly. "Yes, madam, Mr. Reed's been drilling it into me all week," Andrew chuckled, adjusting his saddle. "My wife drives a harder bargain than I do, Walsh. Best remember that." The easy banter, the shared glances between them, all evidence of the healing that had begun. James clung to his father's leg, extracting multiple promises of a special gift from Cheyenne. "Be good for your mother," Andrew instructed, kneeling to embrace his son. "You're the man of the house while I'm gone." "I will, Papa," James promised solemnly. "I'll take care of Mama and Elizabeth." Andrew's expression softened at the mention of the aspen tree, which James had taken to visiting daily, sometimes telling his lost sister about his adventures. "That's my boy." Finally, it was Vivian's turn to say goodbye. Andrew drew her slightly away from the others, his hands warm on her waist. 10 days, he reminded her. 2 weeks at the most. "I'll be counting," Vivian replied, trying to keep her voice light despite the anxiety that still lingered. Andrew studied her face as if committing it to memory. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Almost forgot, this is for you." Vivian unwrapped it carefully to find a journal bound in soft leather, the pages blank and inviting. "Andrew, it's beautiful. Thought you might want to write while I'm gone," he explained. "Your feelings, your thoughts, things you might want to tell me when I return." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Vivian deeply. In their early days together, she'd often kept a journal, recording their adventures as they traveled west. Somewhere along the way, amidst the hard work of homesteading and the demands of motherhood, she'd abandoned the practice. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. "I'll have much to share when you return." Andrew's expression grew serious. "I meant what I said, Viv. I'm coming back to you, to us." "I know," she assured him, and was surprised to realize she truly did believe it now. His kiss was lingering and tender, a promise sealed between them. Then he mounted his horse, tipped his hat to her with a warm smile, and rode out with Timothy and the small herd of cattle. Vivian watched until they disappeared beyond the eastern ridge, James's small hand in hers. Unlike the last time she'd watched Andrew ride away, her heart wasn't heavy with dread. Instead, she felt something that had been absent for too long: hope, bright and sustaining as the Montana sunshine. The days of Andrew's absence passed more quickly than Vivian had anticipated. Between caring for James, maintaining the homestead, and planning for the expansion they'd discussed, she found little time for melancholy. Each evening, she wrote in the journal Andrew had given her, recording not just daily events but her hopes and reflections, creating a bridge across the miles that separated them. On the 10th day after Andrew's departure, Vivian rode into Silver Creek with James to collect mail and supplies. The small frontier town had grown considerably since they'd first settled in the area, boasting a proper general store, a schoolhouse, 2 saloons, and a hotel that catered to the increasing number of travelers passing through on their way farther west. Mrs. Reed. Tom Sanders, the postmaster, hailed her as she tied her horse outside the general store. "Got something for you." Vivian approached the post office counter with James in tow, expecting perhaps a letter from her mother in Boston. Instead, Sanders handed her a telegram. "Came in yesterday," he explained. "Would have sent someone out but didn't have a rider available." Vivian's heart stuttered as she accepted the paper. Telegrams rarely brought good news. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. "Arrived Cheyenne stop sales successful stop returning with buyer stop expect U.S. Friday stop all my love." Andrew relief washed over Vivian in a dizzying wave. Not only was Andrew safe, but he'd successfully completed the sale and was already on his way home with the buyer himself, no less. Friday was just 2 days away. "Good news, Mrs. Reed?" Sanders inquired, noting her radiant smile. "The best," Vivian confirmed. "My husband has concluded his business in Cheyenne and will be home soon." "Glad to hear it," Sanders nodded. Town's not been the same without Reed's steady presence. Too many young hotheads thinking they're faster with a six-shooter than they are. Vivian knew what he meant. Despite Andrew's recent withdrawal, he'd always been respected in Silver Creek as a voice of reason and calm. In a frontier town where disagreements could escalate quickly, such men were invaluable. "Did you hear about the trouble at Thornton's last night?" Sanders continued, lowering his voice slightly. "That new gang from over Billings Way caused quite a ruckus. Marshal Wilson had to lock up 3 of them." Vivian frowned. "I hadn't heard. Were people hurt?" "Nothing serious," Sanders assured her, "but they're still in town, the rest of them, making folks nervous." James tugged at Vivian's skirt. "Mama, can we get candy now?" "Of course, sweetheart." Vivian smiled down at her son, then addressed Sanders once more. "Thank you for the telegram, Mr. Sanders, and the warning. Just stay clear of Thornton's if you're in town after dark," the postmaster advised. "Those boys aren't the type to show proper respect to a lady." Vivian had no intention of remaining in town past sundown, but she appreciated the concern. After purchasing supplies and the promised candy for James, they began the ride home with lighter hearts than they'd had in months. "Papa will be home on Friday," Vivian reminded James as they approached their homestead. "Just 2 more sleeps." "Do you think he got me a present from Cheyenne?" James asked, still struggling with the pronunciation of Cheyenne. "I'm certain he did," Vivian assured him. "Papa always keeps his promises." The words resonated within her with newfound conviction. Andrew had promised to return to them, and he would. Not just physically, he'd been physically present before, while emotionally absent but fully, completely present as the husband and father they needed. That evening, as James slept and Vivian wrote in her journal by lamplight, a sudden noise outside startled her. The distinctive sound of horses approaching multiple horses was unmistakable in the quiet night. Vivian's first thought was of Andrew, but she quickly dismissed it. He wasn't due until Friday, and he'd have only Timothy and possibly the buyer with him. This sounded like a larger group. Setting aside her journal, Vivian moved cautiously to the window. In the moonlight, she could make out 5 riders approaching the cabin. They moved with the loose, confident posture of men who'd been drinking, and Vivian felt a chill of apprehension. Quickly, she retrieved Andrew's spare revolver from the locked box beneath their bed. She'd learned to shoot years ago, a necessity for a woman on the frontier, though she'd never had cause to use the skill in defense. The riders drew up outside the cabin, their voices carrying clearly through the night air. "This the Reed place," one called out. "Heard they got the best cattle in the territory." "Looks like nobody's home," another replied. "Just a light in the window." "Nah, Reed's away," a third voice stated with unsettling certainty. "Postmaster said he's in Wyoming, just the wife and kid here." Vivian's blood ran cold. These must be the troublemakers Sanders had mentioned, the gang from Billings. But how had they known about Andrew's absence? And why target their remote homestead? A fourth voice, deeper than the others, issued commands. "Check the stable for horses. Jackson, go around back. The rest of you with me." Heart pounding, Vivian positioned herself between the door and James's bedroom, the revolver steady in her grip. She'd never killed a man, but to protect her son, she knew she would. Heavy boots thumped on the porch, followed by a sharp knock. "Mrs. Reed." "We're associates of your husband. Need to discuss some business with him." Vivian remained silent, hoping against hope that they'd believe the cabin empty and leave. "Mrs. Reed," the voice hardened. "We know you're in there. Best open up before we get impatient." "My husband isn't here," Vivian called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever business you have can wait until he returns," a low chuckle answered her. "It's not Reed we're interested in at the moment, it's his cattle, and since he's not here to object." "I am," Vivian stated firmly. "And I'm armed. The marshal knows you're in town. He'll be checking on outlying homesteads." This was a bluff Wilson rarely patrolled beyond the town limits, but the men couldn't know that for certain. A muttered conversation outside followed, then the deep voice again. "No need for unpleasantness, Mrs. Reed. We'll just help ourselves to a few head of your cattle and be on our way. You and the boy won't be harmed if you stay inside." Cattle rustlers. The realization brought both relief and anger. They weren't here to hurt her or James, just to steal the livelihood she and Andrew had worked so hard to build. Take one step toward our herd and I'll shoot, Vivian warned. This is private property and you are not welcome here. More muttered conversation than a different approach. Be reasonable, madam. It's 5 against 1 and you've got a child to think about. We'll take what we want regardless. Question is whether anyone gets hurt in the process. Fear and fury warred within Vivian. They were right about the odds and she couldn't risk James's safety. But surrender meant losing the very cattle that represented their future, including the premium Andrew had surely secured in Cheyenne. A soft noise behind her made Vivian turn. James stood in the doorway of his room, eyes wide with fear. "Mama," he whispered. "Who's outside?" "Go back to bed, sweetheart," Vivian urged quietly. "Everything's fine." "Getting impatient out here, Mrs. Reed," the voice called. What's it going to be? In that moment, Vivian made her decision. No cattle, no property of any kind was worth risking her son's life. "Take what you want and go," she called through the door. "But know that my husband will hunt down every last one of you when he returns." A triumphant laugh answered her. "By then, we'll be long gone and your cattle with us." Wise choice, Mrs. Reed. Vivian gathered James into her arms and retreated to the back of the cabin, listening as the men moved toward the pasture where their small herd grazed. Tears of frustration burned her eyes, but she forced them back. She needed to be strong for James, who trembled against her. "It's all right," she soothed, stroking his dark curls. "They're just taking some cows, we're safe." "But there are cows," James protested. "Papa will be mad." "Papa will be glad we're safe," Vivian assured him, though she knew Andrew would be devastated by the loss. Not just financially, but as a blow to the security he'd worked so hard to provide. They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the rustlers gathering cattle. Vivian couldn't tell how many they were taking, hopefully just a few, though she suspected they'd be greedy. After what seemed an eternity, hoofbeats approached the cabin again. Vivian tightened her grip on the revolver, fearing the men had changed their minds about leaving them unharmed. "Much obliged for your hospitality, Mrs. Reed," the leader called mockingly. "Give your husband our regards when he returns." The sound of retreating horses filled Vivian with equal parts relief and despair. They were safe, yes, but at what cost? How much of their livelihood had just disappeared into the night? Once certain the rustlers were truly gone, Vivian settled James back to bed with assurances that everything would be all right. Then she sat at the table, the revolver before her, and waited for dawn. With first light, Vivian assessed the damage. As she'd feared, the rustlers had been thorough. Nearly half their herd was gone, including most of the breeding cows. The loss was devastating, representing not just their current livelihood but their hopes for expansion. After ensuring James was occupied with his toys, Vivian saddled her horse and rode for Silver Creek. Marshal Wilson needed to know what had happened, though she held little hope of recovering the stolen cattle. Rustlers typically drove their ill-gotten gains across territorial lines quickly, making recovery nearly impossible. The marshal received her news with grim resignation. "Been expecting something like this," he admitted. "That bunch has hit 3 other ranches in the past month. Always when the men are away." "How did they know Andrew was gone?" Vivian demanded. "Who would have told them?" Wilson shrugged. "Information travels fast in a small town. Could have overheard it anywhere." "Will you pursue them?" Vivian pressed. "I'll try," Wilson promised. "But they've got a good head start, and I can't leave town unprotected to chase after them. Best I can do is send telegrams to lawmen in likely directions." It was the answer Vivian had expected, but it still left her cold with disappointment. She'd have to return home and wait for Andrew, dreading the moment she'd have to tell him that half their livelihood was gone. The next 2 days passed in anxious anticipation. Vivian considered sending a telegram to Cheyenne, but realized Andrew was already on his way home. Better to tell him in person, she decided, than have him receive such news while on the trail. Friday dawned clear and warm. Vivian kept James close to the cabin, not wanting him to notice the depleted herd until after she'd spoken with Andrew. She'd just finished preparing a special welcome home dinner when the sound of approaching riders reached her ears. "Papa's home," James exclaimed, racing for the door before Vivian could stop him. She followed more slowly, apprehension warring with joy at Andrew's return. As she stepped onto the porch, she saw not just Andrew and Timothy, but a third man, presumably Victor Holloway, the Wyoming buyer. All three looked travel-weary but pleased until Andrew's gaze moved past Vivian to the half-empty pasture beyond. His expression shifted instantly from contentment to alarm. Dismounting quickly, he strode toward her, his eyes questioning. "Vivian, what happened to the herd?" James reached him first, throwing his arms around Andrew's waist. "Bad men took our cows, Papa. They came at night and Mama had your gun, but she let them take the cows so we wouldn't get hurt." Andrew's face paled as he looked from his son to Vivian. "Rustlers? When?" "Wednesday night," Vivian confirmed, descending the porch steps. "5 men from that gang Marshal Wilson mentioned. They knew you were away." Timothy and Holloway exchanged concerned glances behind Andrew but remained silent as husband and wife faced each other. "Are you both all right?" Andrew asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "They didn't harm you. We're fine," Vivian assured him. "They just wanted the cattle. I'm so sorry, Andrew. I couldn't stop them." Andrew's expression softened immediately. "Of course you couldn't. You did exactly right, protecting yourself and James." He embraced her fiercely, then knelt to include James in the hug. "Nothing matters more than you two. Cattle can be replaced." The relief that flooded Vivian was so intense she nearly wept. She'd feared anger, disappointment, or worst of all, a return to the emotional distance they'd worked so hard to overcome. "Marshal Wilson sent telegrams," she explained. "But he doesn't hold much hope of recovery." Andrew nodded grimly. "Rustlers like that usually have arrangements to change brands and move the cattle quickly." He stood, keeping one arm around Vivian as he turned to his companions. "Mr. Holloway, I apologize for this welcome. This is my wife, Vivian, and our son, James." Holloway, a substantial man in his 50s with a well-trimmed beard, stepped forward to tip his hat. "Mrs. Reed, a pleasure despite the circumstances. Your husband speaks very highly of you." "Thank you for coming all this way," Vivian replied, summoning her best hostess manner despite the situation. "You must be tired from your journey. Please come inside. Dinner is ready." As they moved toward the cabin, Andrew held Vivian back slightly, speaking low. "How many did they take?" "Nearly half," Vivian admitted. "Mostly the breeding stock." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he nodded acceptance. "We'll discuss it later. For now, let's see to our guest." The meal was a strained affair despite everyone's best efforts. Holloway attempted to lighten the mood with tales of Wyoming ranching, while Timothy regaled James with stories of Cheyenne. Andrew participated in the conversation, but Vivian could see the tension in his shoulders, the concern in his eyes whenever he thought no one was watching. After dinner, while Holloway retired to the barn where they'd prepared sleeping quarters for him and Timothy, Andrew finally addressed the situation directly. "Tell me everything," he requested once James was in bed. "Every detail you can remember." Vivian recounted the night of the rustling as precisely as possible, the men's voices, their comments, the direction they'd headed afterward. Andrew listened intently, asking occasional questions but never interrupting. 5 men, he mused when she'd finished, led by a tall man with a deep voice. "Sounds like the Blackwell gang. They've been operating out of Montana City for months." "You know them?" Vivian asked, surprised. Andrew shook his head. "Know of them. Every rancher in the territory does. They're organized, which makes them dangerous." "What will we do?" Vivian asked, the question that had been weighing on her since that night. "Can we recover from this?" Andrew was silent for a long moment, calculating. The sale in Cheyenne went well better than expected. Holloway paid premium prices for the bull calves and wants a regular arrangement. He reached for her hand across the table. "It's a setback, Vive, no denying that, but not a disaster. But our plans for expansion will proceed," Andrew finished firmly. "Just more slowly than we'd hoped. The money from Cheyenne will replace the breeding stock we'll build back." The determination in his voice, the absence of blame or despair, these were gifts Vivian hadn't dared hope for. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Not just of the rustlers, but of telling you, after everything we've been through, to face another setback." Andrew squeezed her hand. "Listen to me, Vivian Reed. Nothing, no cattle, no money, nothing material matters more to me than you and James. I lost sight of that once, never again." The conviction in his voice brought tears to Vivian's eyes. This was the man she'd married, strong, resilient, devoted to his family above all else. The man who had disappeared for a time into grief but had found his way back to her. "I've missed you," she whispered, the words encompassing far more than his physical absence of the past 2 weeks. Andrew rounded the table and pulled her to her feet into his embrace. "I'm here now," he promised, "and I'm not going anywhere." The following morning brought renewed purpose. After Holloway's departure with promises of future business, Andrew and Timothy rode to Silver Creek to file a formal report with Marshal Wilson. Vivian remained at the homestead with James, taking inventory of their remaining cattle and calculating what they'd need to rebuild. When Andrew returned that afternoon, he carried not just supplies but news. "Wilson tracked the rustlers as far as the territorial border," he reported. "Lost the trail there as expected, but he's got descriptions out to every lawman within 100 miles. So there's still hope of recovery." Vivian asked, trying not to sound too optimistic. "Slim chance," Andrew admitted. "But not impossible. More importantly, I spoke with the bank. We can secure a small loan against the Cheyenne proceeds to replace the breeding stock immediately." Vivian smiled despite herself. "You're really determined to make this expansion happen, aren't you?" "More determined than ever," Andrew confirmed, his blue eyes intense. "What happened here while I was gone, I never want you to feel that vulnerable again. The sooner we build this ranch into something substantial, the safer we'll all be." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple, Andrew shared more of his vision for their future. Not just a larger cattle operation, but eventually a proper house to replace their cabin, perhaps even neighbors, other families drawn to the fertile valley they'd chosen. "I was thinking," Vivian ventured during a lull in the conversation, "about what you said regarding feeling vulnerable. Perhaps it's time I improved my shooting skills." Andrew looked at her with surprise. "You've always been a fair shot." "Fair isn't good enough," Vivian replied. "Not out here. Next time, if there is a next time, I want to be able to defend what's ours." Pride shone in Andrew's eyes. "I'll teach you myself, starting tomorrow." True to his word, Andrew began Vivian's shooting lessons the next day. They started with stationary targets, then progressed to moving ones. Andrew proved a patient teacher, correcting her stance and grip with gentle touches that often lingered longer than strictly necessary. "You're a natural," he praised as Vivian hit 5 targets in succession. "Better than most men I've taught. You've taught many." Vivian inquired, lowering the revolver. A shadow crossed Andrew's face. "During the war, trained recruits before they sent us south." It was a rare reference to Andrew's service in the Union Army, a subject he typically avoided. Vivian knew only that he'd fought in several major battles and had been wounded at Gettysburg. The experience had left him with occasional nightmares and a deep aversion to unnecessary violence. "I didn't know you were an instructor," Vivian said carefully, sensing an opening to a part of his past he rarely shared. Andrew nodded, his gaze distant. For a while, then they needed every able body on the front lines. He shook himself, returning to the present. "But that's ancient history. Let's try from a greater distance." As summer progressed into early autumn, life at the Reed homestead settled into a new rhythm. With the loan secured, they purchased replacement breeding stock, fewer than they'd lost, but of higher quality. Timothy Walsh, impressed by Andrew's knowledge and fairness, accepted a permanent position as their ranch hand, constructing a small cabin of his own near the stable. Most significantly, the emotional distance that had separated Vivian and Andrew for so long continued to diminish. They spoke openly now about their lost daughter, about their hopes for the future, about the everyday challenges of frontier life. In the privacy of their bedroom, they rediscovered the physical connection that had once come so naturally, their passion rekindled and deepened by the trials they'd overcome. One crisp October morning, as they inspected the aspen tree that had grown surprisingly tall in its first months, Andrew made an unexpected suggestion. "I've been thinking about James's education," he began, watching their son chase falling leaves nearby. "He'll be 6 next spring." "Old enough for proper schooling," Vivian nodded. "The school in Silver Creek is improving. Mrs. Porter is an excellent teacher from what I hear." True, Andrew agreed, but I was thinking of something more permanent, something here. Vivian looked at him questioningly. A tutor, you mean? Andrew smiled, taking her hand. No, a sibling. The simple statement stole Vivian's breath. Since the stillbirth, they'd never discussed having another child. The subject had seemed too painful, too fraught with the possibility of renewed grief. Andrew, she began cautiously, are you certain? After what happened, I'm not saying it wouldn't be frightening, he acknowledged, for both of us. But James shouldn't grow up alone out here, and we always wanted a larger family. Vivian studied his face, searching for any sign of doubt or reservation. Finding none, she allowed hope to blossom in her chest. I'd like that, she admitted. Very much. Andrew drew her into his arms, his voice low and intimate. It won't replace her, nothing could, but perhaps it's time to look forward instead of back. Yes, Vivian agreed, resting her head against his chest. I think it is. That winter proved milder than the previous one, allowing work on the ranch to continue with minimal interruption. By spring of 1884, the evidence of the rustlers' raid had been largely erased. Their herd, though still smaller than before, was healthier and more valuable. The loan had been repaid ahead of schedule, and plans for a new, larger house were taking shape. On a warm May afternoon, nearly a year after the emotional chasm between them had begun to heal, Vivian sat at the kitchen table, a letter from her brother Alex in one hand. Her other hand resting lightly on her stomach, where the first signs of pregnancy had begun to show. The sound of hoofbeats announced Andrew's return from Silver Creek. He entered with an armful of packages, supplies, mail, and a special order he'd placed weeks earlier. You're just in time, Vivian greeted him. I've received the most interesting letter from Alex. Andrew hung his hat by the door and joined her at the table. Good news, I hope. The best, Vivian confirmed. He's engaged to be married, a Miss Charlotte Winters from Denver. Apparently they met at a banking conference, of all places. Your brother finding romance at a banking conference. Andrew chuckled. That sounds about right. When's the wedding? August in Denver. Vivian hesitated. He's invited us, of course, all of us. Andrew considered this. Denver in August, that's a considerable journey in your condition. I know, Vivian acknowledged. But I'd love for Alex to meet James, and to see us as we are now, not as he remembers us from his visit. Andrew studied her face, then nodded decisively. Then we'll go. Timothy can manage things here for a week or two, and I've been meaning to speak with some cattle brokers in Denver anyway. Always thinking of business, Vivian teased, though she was pleased by his ready agreement. Not always, Andrew countered with a smile. He retrieved one of the packages he'd brought home and placed it before her. This arrived today. Vivian unwrapped it carefully to reveal a beautifully bound book, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson. Oh, Andrew, she breathed. It's lovely. Thought you might want something besides that journal to occupy your evenings, he explained, especially now that we're expecting again. Vivian leafed through the volume, touched by his thoughtfulness. Then a particular poem caught her eye, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. She read it aloud, the words resonating deeply after all they'd endured. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Andrew listened, his expression softening. When she finished, he took her hand across the table, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring. Appropriate, wouldn't you say? Very, Vivian agreed. Hope never truly left us, did it, even in our darkest moments? No, Andrew confirmed, his voice husky with emotion. It was always there, waiting for us to hear it again. As they sat together in the warmth of their home, Vivian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From the depths of shared grief to the heights of renewed love, they had traversed emotional terrain as vast and challenging as the Montana wilderness itself. Yet here they were stronger for having weathered the storm together, their bond not weakened but fortified by the trials they'd faced. Outside the window, the aspen tree Elizabeth's tree swayed gently in the spring breeze, its leaves catching the golden afternoon light. Beside it, James played with the wooden horse Andrew had carved for him a year ago, his laughter carrying on the wind. And within Vivian, new life grew, a testament to their enduring faith in each other and in the future they were building together. Andrew followed her gaze to the window and squeezed her hand gently. "We'll be all right, Vive," he said softly. "All of us." And in that moment, with her husband's warm hand holding hers, Vivian knew with absolute certainty that he was right. The cowboy who had once grown so cold had found his way back to warmth, and the heart that beat between them burned brighter than ever before. 15 years later, in the summer of 1899, the Reed Ranch stood as one of the most prosperous in the territory. The small cabin where their story began had been replaced by a handsome two-story house, surrounded by cottonwood trees and flower gardens that Vivian tended with loving care. The aspen Elizabeth tree had grown tall and strong, its slender trunk now sturdy enough to support the swing where 13-year-old Charlotte Reed often sat reading on summer afternoons. The herd that had once been decimated by rustlers now numbered in the hundreds, managed by Andrew with the assistance of James, now 21 and every bit his father's son in determination and principle. Their middle child, William, at 14, showed more interest in books than cattle, a predilection that Andrew encouraged despite his own limited formal education. On this particular evening, as the family gathered on the wide porch to escape the lingering heat of the day, Vivian watched her husband descend from the ridge that overlooked their property. At 52, Andrew Reed remained as handsome as ever to her eyes, though silver now dominated his once dark hair, and the lines around his eyes had deepened with the passing years. "Papa's back," Charlotte exclaimed, abandoning her book to race down the porch steps. Of all their children, she most resembled Vivian, with the same chestnut hair and determined chin. But her eyes were Andrew's, that clear, piercing blue that still made Vivian's heart skip when directed at her with full attention. "Careful, Charlie," William called after his sister, using the nickname she preferred. "You know how Apollo gets when you run at him." "Apollo retired 3 years ago, bookworm," Charlotte retorted over her shoulder. "Papa rides thunder now." James, who had been discussing cattle prices with Vivian, shook his head with a smile. "Some things never change. Thank goodness for that," Vivian replied, watching as Andrew dismounted to receive Charlotte's enthusiastic greeting. Together, father and daughter ascended to the porch, Charlotte chattering about her day while Andrew listened with the same attentive interest he'd always shown his children. "Found a pair of mountain lions up near the North Ridge," he reported to James as he settled into the chair beside Vivian. "Might want to move the yearlings to the lower pasture for a few days." James nodded, already calculating the logistics. "I'll have the men handle it first thing tomorrow." "How was Mrs. Henderson?" Vivian inquired, passing Andrew a glass of lemonade. At 73, Martha Henderson remained a cherished friend, though age had finally convinced her to sell her homestead and move into a small house in Silver Creek that Andrew had helped her purchase. "Ornery as ever," Andrew replied with affection. "Says the town doctor is a fool who doesn't know rheumatism from rhetoric. Wants you to bring her more of that willow bark tea next time you're in town." Vivian smiled, making a mental note. "I'll ride in tomorrow. We need supplies anyway." As the conversation flowed around them, Andrew reached for Vivian's hand, a gesture that had become so natural over the years that neither of them remarked upon it. His calloused fingers intertwined with hers, warm and secure. Later, after the children had retired and the house had quieted for the night, they stood together at the window of their bedroom, looking out over the land they transformed through years of shared labor and love. "I rode by the old cabin site today," Andrew mentioned, his arms encircling Vivian from behind. "Hard to believe we started with so little." "We had everything that mattered," Vivian countered, leaning back against his chest. "We still do." Andrew's lips brushed her temple, a gesture as familiar as breathing yet still capable of sending warmth through her veins. "You know what I was thinking about on the ride back today?" "What's that?" "That day you confronted me after I'd been to town. When you refused to let me push you away anymore." His voice grew thoughtful. "I was so lost then, Vive, so consumed by what we'd lost that I couldn't see what we still had." Vivian turned in his arms to face him. "We both were in different ways, but we found our way back." "Because of you," Andrew stated with quiet certainty. Your strength, your refusal to give up on you, Vivian corrected gently. I never could. Andrew's hand rose to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the fine lines that the years had etched beside her eyes. At 47, Vivian Reed remained as beautiful to him as the young woman who had followed him west in search of adventure and a love worth building a life upon. 15 years, he mused. Since that spring when everything changed. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. And sometimes, Vivian added with a smile, like several lifetimes ago. Regrets? Andrew asked, though the question held no real doubt. Not one, Vivian assured him. Every moment the joy and the sorrow alike has brought us here. How could I regret that? Andrew's kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of the bond that had weathered so much and emerged stronger for the tempering. When he drew back, his eyes held the same warmth that had first captured Vivian's heart in a Boston drawing room all those years ago. I love you, Vivian Reed, he said simply. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. And I love you, she replied, the words as true now as they had been when first spoken on their wedding day, always and completely. Outside their window, the Montana night unfurled in all its vastness, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Below, the land they'd claimed and tamed spread in peaceful prosperity. And between them, the love that had once nearly been extinguished by grief now burned steady and bright, a beacon that had guided them through darkness into the light of a future neither could have imagined when they began their journey together. In each other's arms, they had found not just shelter from life's storms, but the courage to weather them. Not just companionship, but a partnership that strengthened them both. Not just passion, but a love that had matured like fine wine, growing richer and more complex with the passing years. The cowboy and his bride. The man who had once grown cold and the woman who had refused to let the fire between them die. Together, they had written a story across the wild Montana landscape, a story of loss and recovery, of resilience and hope, of a love strong enough to endure whatever life might bring. And in the quiet of their room, with the future stretching before them as vast and promising as the western sky, they held each other close, grateful for the journey that had brought them home.